You found Psychotic Confessions. This is a place for the stories people don't tell in daylight, the ones that stay with you, the ones that don't have clean endings. Settle in, turn the lights down. And whatever you do, don't listen to this alone.
Tonight's story starts the way most disturbing things do, quietly. There was a note. One page, handwritten, left on a kitchen table in a house that had already been empty for 14 months. The handwriting was my sister's. I'd know it anywhere. The way she looped her lowercase g's, the way she pressed too hard on the pen when she was anxious, leaving grooves in the paper you could feel with your fingertip. I'd read that note a dozen times after she disappeared. The police had read it. My parents had read it. Everyone agreed it was strange, but no one could say exactly why. Strange like a dream you can't fully remember. Strange in a way that sat wrong, but didn't give you anything to hold on to. It took 14 months, 2 conversations I wish I'd never had, and one very long night alone in her empty house, before I finally understood what Claire had written. And I want to be honest with you right now, before this goes any further. I wish I still didn't. Claire was 27 when she disappeared from Harlow Creek. If you've never heard of Harlow Creek, that's because there's almost nothing to hear. It's the kind of town that exists between exits on a highway, a gas station, a diner that's been there since 1987, a post office that closes at noon on Fridays, and about 4,000 people who mostly grew up there and mostly stayed. Claire had taken a job at the county library, a job she genuinely loved. She had friends there. She had a house she rented on Aldermore Street, a small 2-bedroom with a covered porch, and a garden she was slowly, optimistically, turning into something that might grow herbs someday. She was not depressed. I want to say that clearly because it became the dominant theory once she was gone. And it was wrong in the way that lazy theories are wrong, not entirely without foundation, but built on the flimsiest possible reading of the evidence. Yes, Claire was quiet. Yes, Claire spent a lot of time alone. Yes, Claire had gone through a bad breakup about 18 months before she disappeared. But quiet and solitary and post-breakup are not synonyms for in crisis. I knew my sister. We talked on the phone twice a week, sometimes more. I would have known. She was careful, too. That's the other thing I always want people to understand about her. Claire was the kind of person who locked her car the moment she got in, before she even started the engine. She kept her location shared with me on her phone, not because she was paranoid, but because she'd read enough news to understand that the world occasionally required it. She had a spare key hidden in a fake rock in the garden. She told me where, made me memorize it. She changed the code on her alarm system every 6 months and texted me the new one every time. She was not reckless. She was not someone you could easily predict a disappearance for, if that makes sense. She wasn't a story that wanted to happen. I drove up to Harlow Creek maybe 6 weeks before she disappeared. A Saturday visit, nothing planned. We went to the diner. We walked around the farmer's market. We sat on her porch in the late afternoon and drank iced tea. We talked about almost nothing. It was a good day, ordinary in the best possible way. The only thing I noticed, and I didn't register it as significant at the time, at some point in the early evening, when the light started to go and the street got quieter, Claire got up without saying anything and went inside and closed the porch door behind her. Then I heard her moving through the house, and one by one, the sound of curtains being drawn. Every window, front of the house, sides back. By the time she came back out, the interior was completely dark. I asked her about it. She smiled the way you smile when you want to end a topic rather than discuss it. Moths, she said. They come in if you leave the lights on with the windows open. It was a reasonable answer. It was August. I didn't push it. But the thing is, and I didn't realize this until much later, the logic didn't hold. We weren't sitting near any windows. The porch was screened. There was no reason to close the curtains inside the house to keep moths out of a screened porch. But it was delivered so casually, so matter-of-factly, that I let it go. That was the first thing. The second thing was smaller still. We were saying goodbye in the driveway, hugging, the usual routine. And I pulled back and saw her looking past me toward the end of the street, just for a second. Her eyes moved there and then came back to me, and she finished the hug, and she said, "Drive safe," and she went inside. I turned and looked toward the end of the street. There was nothing there. A stop sign, a parked truck that had been there all day, the beginning of the crossroad that led out toward the highway. Nothing unusual. I drove home. 2 hours south. I made dinner, watched something forgettable on television, went to bed. Claire disappeared 11 days later. The call came from my mother on a Tuesday morning. She'd been trying to reach Claire since Sunday and hadn't been able to. Claire's phone went straight to voicemail. Her car was still in the driveway on Aldermore Street. A neighbor had confirmed that. Ruth said she hadn't seen Claire since Saturday, maybe earlier. They'd sent someone over, a deputy named Marsh, and he'd found the house locked. The house was in order, nothing overturned, nothing missing as far as anyone could tell. Claire's phone was on the kitchen counter, plugged into its charger. Her wallet was in her bag, which was hanging on the hook by the front door. Her keys were on the kitchen table, next to a single sheet of paper. By the time I arrived in Harlow Creek that afternoon, Marsh had already photographed the note and taken it in as part of the file. My mother showed me the photo on her phone, hands shaking slightly. And I stood in Claire's kitchen and read it for the first time. I'm going to read it to you now. I have it memorized. I don't think I could forget it if I tried. I don't know if this makes sense to anyone but me. I've been trying to find a way to explain it and I can't, so I'm just going to write down what I've seen. He stands outside the window of my bedroom. The window that faces the side yard, not the street. He comes between 11 and midnight, but not every night, maybe 4 nights out of 7. He doesn't move. He doesn't try to come in. He stands in the gap between the fence and the wall of the house, which is about 3 feet wide, and he faces the window. I can only see him when there's enough ambient light from the street. On cloudy nights, I can't see him, but I know he's there because I can hear the fence creak when he leans against it. He is taller than average. He wears dark clothing. I have never seen his face. He has been doing this for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. I don't know when it started. I only know when I noticed. I've called the non-emergency line twice. The first time an officer came by, walked around the perimeter, found nothing, and told me it was probably an animal or a shadow. The second time, they didn't send anyone. They told me to call back if I saw him again. I've been keeping a log. The dates are on the back. Deputy Marsh had read the note, read the log, walked around the exterior of the house, found no signs of forced entry or struggle. He filed the case initially as a voluntary missing person, the technical classification for an adult who leaves without apparent coercion. He thought she'd imagined it and run away. I did not think she'd imagined it. I drove to her house the next morning with a copy of the note, which my mother had printed from the photo. I let myself in with the spare key from the fake rock in the garden, and I started reading more carefully. The first reading of Claire's note feels like reading a missing person report. Someone scared, documenting what scared them, unable to get help. The second reading is different. I sat at Claire's kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made from the last of what was in her cabinet, and I read the note again from the beginning. And this time, going slower, I started to feel the thing underneath it. It was the level of detail. Claire hadn't just written "a man stands outside my window." She had written a document. The gap between the fence and the wall measured 3 feet. She'd measured it. She knew he arrived between 11 and midnight. She knew he came approximately 4 nights out of 7. She knew which direction he left in when he left. She had 17 entries over 6 weeks, with timestamps accurate to within 5 minutes. This was not the writing of someone in a paranoid spiral. This was the writing of someone conducting an observation. Someone tracking something the way you track something when you are trying to prove it is real, because you already know it is, and you know no one will believe you without the evidence. I turned to the log on the back. I had skimmed it before. Now I read every entry. The first 9 entries were consistent with what the note described: a figure in the side yard, times, durations, behavior. The writing was small, compressed into the limited space, but clear and steady. Then, around entry 10, approximately 4 weeks into the log, something changed. The entry started to include a second column of information. At first, I thought it was additional notes about the figure, but when I read carefully, I realized it wasn't about the figure at all. It was about what the figure appeared to know. 11:34 p.m., present approx. 25 min. During this time, I was sitting at kitchen table, reading. I did not approach the window. He did not move from position. At some point during this period, I got up to get a glass of water. When I returned to the table, the figure had moved slightly, repositioned toward the kitchen window rather than the bedroom window. The kitchen window faces the same side yard but is set further back. He should not have been able to see my movement through the bedroom window from that angle. But he moved. 11:18 p.m. I had not turned on the bedroom light. I had been in the bedroom with only the phone screen for light, low brightness, screen angled away from window. He was still there. I turned the light on and off 3 times quickly. He did not react. But when I turned my phone completely off and waited, I heard the fence creak. He shifted position. Response to darkness, not to light. I tried something. I kept all the lights on, moved normally through the house, let the windows be uncovered. I wanted to see if the behavior changed when observation was easy versus difficult. He came at 11:41, earlier than usual. He stood at the bedroom window for approximately 12 minutes, then moved to the kitchen window. Then around to the back of the house for the first time. I heard him on the gravel path. The back of the house is where the garden is, where I go in the mornings. I put the note down. I picked it up again. I kept arriving at the same conclusion. Claire had not just observed someone watching her. She had studied him. She had run quiet experiments, changed her own behavior, and cataloged his responses. Tried to understand the parameters of what she was dealing with. She had built a profile. And the profile was of someone who was not simply watching her house, someone who was watching her, responding to her movements, tracking her through walls. I went to the side yard. The gap between the fence and the wall of the house was exactly what Claire had described. 3 feet, maybe a little less. The fence itself was wooden, old, slightly weathered, the kind that creaks when you lean weight against it. At the approximate midpoint of the gap, at roughly chest height, there was a small section of fence where the wood was slightly darker than the surrounding panels. Slightly compressed, the grain subtly flattened, the mark of something pressing against it repeatedly over time. I stood there for a while looking at that mark. Claire had not imagined this. I went back inside and read entry 15, which I had initially skipped because the handwriting had compressed almost to illegibility. I had to hold the paper at an angle to the kitchen light to make it out. I know who it is. I think I've known for a while. I haven't written it down because writing it down makes it real, and I am not ready for it to be real. But I think I need to write it down now because if something happens and this is the only record, someone needs to know. That sentence, if something happens, was what made me sit down heavily in her kitchen chair. She had written this knowing it might be read without her. And below the name, she had written one more line in the smallest handwriting of the entire document, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. He knows about Daniel too. I called my mother that night and asked her, as calmly as I could, if anyone had interviewed the neighbors. All of them, not just Ruth. I drove to Aldermore Street the next morning and knocked on doors. Ruth was the most helpful. She was in her mid-60s, sharp-eyed, the kind of observant that comes from years of having a particular relationship with her own front window. A car she didn't recognize, parked at the end of the street. Not every night, but often enough that she'd started to notice. Dark-colored navy or black, hard to tell under the street light. She hadn't written down the plate because she'd told herself it was a visitor for one of the other houses. It had stopped appearing about a week before Claire disappeared. She went and got a calendar from her kitchen wall, the kind with a small notes column for each day, and paged back 2 months. She'd made small marks on several days, excess mostly with no label. I asked her what they meant. She looked at the calendar and then at me. I started marking the nights I saw the car, she said. I don't know why. It just seemed like something worth keeping track of. I took a photo of the calendar. When I got back to Claire's house, I compared Ruth's marks against Claire's log. 17 dates in Claire's log. 15 of them had corresponding marks in Ruth's calendar. 15 nights when a stranger's car sat at the end of Aldermore Street were also nights when my sister documented a figure standing in her side yard. Claire had not imagined it. I called Marsh. I told him what I'd found. He took the information down in the way that people take information down when they're not sure what to do with it, but also don't want to say so outright. He said he'd follow up. He asked me not to pursue it independently. I said I understood. I didn't stop. He knows about Daniel too. I kept returning to that line. Not just because it was my name, but because of what it implied about the scope of what Claire had been living with. If he knew about me, then he wasn't just watching a window. He was watching a life. The surrounding infrastructure of a person, who they called, who visited, who they mentioned, what they talked about on a porch on a Saturday afternoon. I thought about that visit, the last time I'd seen her. The porch, the iced tea, the moth's explanation for the curtains. The way she'd looked toward the end of the street when I was leaving. She'd known, that afternoon, that someone might be watching. And she hadn't told me. She'd protected me from it, or tried to, in the way that Claire always tried to absorb things quietly rather than distribute them. There had been a period, maybe 8 or 9 weeks before Claire disappeared, when I'd noticed something I dismissed almost immediately. A stretch of the drive where I'd had the vague and untethered feeling of being noticed. Not followed, not exactly, just present to someone. It had lasted maybe a week and then stopped, and I'd written it off as the ambient, low-grade paranoia of living alone in a city and reading too much news before bed. But now I sat in her kitchen and I thought, what if it wasn't the ambient, low-grade paranoia? What if he'd come to where I lived briefly and looked at me, and then gone back to Harlow Creek and stood in Claire's side yard and waited? I don't have evidence for that. I want to be clear about that. I have a feeling, a retroactive unease, and a line in my sister's handwriting that says he knows about me. I spent 3 days in Harlow Creek. I stayed in Claire's house because the alternative was the motel near the highway, and I found I couldn't leave her space unoccupied. I slept in her bed, or didn't sleep mostly, and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds the house made. The creaking of the old structure, the occasional car on the street, the specific and different sound of the side yard when the wind moved through it. On the second night, at 11:40-something, I heard the fence creak. I lay completely still. It creaked again, once. A slow, weighted sound, the sound of something applying pressure rather than being moved by wind. Wind creak and weight creak are different sounds. I know that now with a certainty I didn't have before. So I stayed still, I breathed slowly. I watched the ceiling in the dark. His behavior changed based on what he perceived. He repositioned based on our movements. He responded to darkness. He was reading the house. The fence creaked one more time, a slightly different register, the sound of something releasing rather than pressing. And then there was nothing. I checked the time on my phone, face angled away from the window. 11:52. I added it to the log. Same document, same format, different handwriting. Entry 18. I drove back to the city on the 4th day. I had to work. I had a life that required my presence in it. But before I left, I did 2 things. The first was to go to the side yard one more time and take careful, well-lit photographs of the mark on the fence. The sightlines from the gap to the bedroom window and the kitchen window and the back garden. I photographed the gravel path at the back where Claire had heard him walking. I photographed every window of the house from the exterior, marking the angles. The second thing was to sit at the kitchen table with the note and reread the final entry in the log. The one about knowing who it was, the name she hadn't wanted to make real. I turned the paper over and wrote my own entry beneath hers. Just a few lines, just what I'd heard on the second night. The time, the duration, the sound of weight against the fence. And at the end I wrote, she was right about all of it. Then I folded the paper, put it in my jacket pocket and drove south. That was the last time I was in Claire's house before she came back. 6 weeks and 3 days after she disappeared, my mother called me at 7 in the morning. "She's here," my mother said. Just that, she's here. I drove the 2 hours in under 90 minutes, and I'm not going to pretend I drove carefully. Claire was sitting in my parents' living room when I arrived. She was on the couch in clean clothes, clothes my mother had given her, not her own, with her hands folded in her lap. She looked the same. That was the first thought. She looked exactly the same, which is not what I'd expected, not after 6 weeks of nothing. She was a little thinner. Her hair was slightly longer. She had the look of someone who'd been somewhere and returned without bringing the somewhere back with them. That slightly unmoored quality of a person who hasn't quite landed yet. She hugged me. She held on for a long time. I counted the seconds in the way you do when something feels important enough to be counted. When she sat back down, I sat across from her and I asked, as gently as I could, where she had been. She said she didn't know. She said it simply, without drama, in the same tone you'd use to say, "I'm not sure what time the pharmacy closes." Not a deflection, not avoidance, just the plain statement of fact from someone reporting the honest condition of their own memory. I do not know where I was. She remembered Saturday. She remembered being in the house on Saturday. She remembered making dinner, pasta, with the last of a jar of tomato sauce she'd been meaning to replace. She remembered eating it at the kitchen table. And then she remembered sitting on my parents' couch at 7 in the morning 6 weeks later. Nothing between. The doctors found nothing wrong. Physically, she was fine. Dehydrated, a little malnourished, some sun exposure but structurally intact. No signs of violence or coercion, neurologically within normal range. They used the phrase dissociative episode with the carefully non-committal delivery of medical professionals who don't want to be held to an explanation they're not fully confident in. The police were cautious. They treated her gently, asked questions without pressure, got very little back. She cooperated completely. She simply had nothing to give them. My parents were so relieved she was back that the other questions slid into second place for them, which was natural and human, and exactly how it should have been. But I couldn't stop looking at her. Something was different, not wrong exactly, not immediately obviously wrong. Just slightly off in a way I couldn't locate, like a word you know but can't quite pronounce. Like a piece of furniture moved 3 inches from where it usually stands. Everything there, everything approximately right, but requiring slightly more processing than it should. I watched her drink a cup of tea my mother made. I watched her talk appropriately, warmly, saying the right things to our parents. I watched her look out the window at the driveway, at the street, at the ordinary morning. I watched her look at me. The way she looked at me, that was where I first felt it. That low, cold arrival of something I didn't have a word for. She looked at me the same way she always had, direct, slightly warm, the particular quality of a sibling's recognition. But underneath it, or behind it, there was something new, something assessing. The quality of a look from someone who is asking a question without asking a question. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself I had spent 6 weeks in a state of elevated anxiety and grief and unresolved fear. That my nervous system was now pattern matching on insufficient evidence. I told myself Claire was home and she was safe, and that was what mattered. I stayed for 3 days. On the second day, she said something that stopped me in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who wasn't inside my own head. We were on the porch, my parents' porch, not hers, in the late afternoon. The kind of ordinary sibling comfort of sitting near each other without needing to fill the space. And she mentioned, offhand, the way you mention something that's just surfaced in memory, that she'd been thinking about my apartment. Your kitchen, she said, the one with the window that faces the alley. I don't have a window that faces an alley. I have a window that faces a small courtyard between my building and the next. It's not an alley, it's a courtyard. Small distinction, but a real one. Claire had visited my apartment twice in the past 3 years, both times in the daytime, and I had never described the view to her in any particular detail. I said carefully, "Which window?" "The one above the sink," she said, "where you can see across to the building next door." That was accurate, but that's not an alley. I asked her where she'd heard me describe it as facing an alley. She frowned, slightly puzzled. "I don't know," she said. "I think I just assumed." Alley, the word that someone who had stood in the courtyard at the right angle might use. From outside, looking up. The courtyard is narrow. It could look like an alley. I didn't say anything else about it. That night after my parents had gone to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table and I opened the photo of Claire's log and I read it again. All of it. And I thought about the period 8 weeks before she disappeared when I'd felt noticed, present to someone, on my commute. And I thought about the word alley. And I thought about the last line of the note. He knows about Daniel too. Had he told her? In whatever 6 weeks she couldn't remember had she been with him, and had he told her things? Things she'd absorbed without knowing she'd absorbed them. Fragments of information sitting just below the level of conscious recall, surfacing now in careless moments as casually wrong words. Or was it something else? Something I didn't want to follow to its end. I flew home on the 3rd day. I had to, but before I left, I did something I'm not sure I should have done. I went to Claire's room. She was staying in her old room at my parents' house, and I left a small piece of paper on the nightstand. Nothing meaningful, just a line from a book we'd both read years ago. A line she would recognize and I would recognize, and no one else would know was anything other than a random quote. A test, the kind Claire herself would have designed. She texted me that evening, after I was back home, an hour after I knew she'd gone to bed. "I saw what you left. I don't know what it means, but I think you're asking me something." I stared at that message for a long time. Because the book the line was from, I hadn't included the title. I hadn't included any attribution. I had written 7 words on a slip of paper and left them on a nightstand. If you didn't already know the book, you couldn't know it was a quotation at all. She hadn't said I recognized that. She hadn't said that's from the book we read in high school. She'd said, "I don't know what it means." The Claire I knew would have recognized it. We had read that book together during a summer when we were teenagers, and it had meant something specific to both of us. The Claire on the other end of that text message apparently had not. I didn't reply that night. I sat with my phone and the feeling in my chest that I didn't know what to call. I let the silence between us extend because I needed time to think about what came next. What came next arrived without me. 3 weeks after Claire came home, I received a piece of mail at my apartment. Handwritten envelope, my name and address, no return address, Harlow Creek postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwriting I recognized, but it wasn't quite right. The letters were almost identical to Claire's, the looped G's, the hard pen pressure, but the spacing was different, slightly too regular. A near-perfect copy, the kind of copy that's wrong in ways you can only identify if you know the original well enough. I read what it said. "You've been very careful, that's good. It's important to be careful. She's different now, I know you've noticed. You're right to notice, but she's still her, most of her. The parts that matter are still there. Don't ask her about the alley. She doesn't know she said that. It would only confuse her. Keep the note somewhere safe. Not in the house, not in the car, somewhere only you know. I'll explain more when I can. Not yet." There was no signature. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen with the window that faces a courtyard that looks like an alley from the outside, from below, from a certain angle. And I read that letter 4 times. And then I put it in my jacket pocket next to the note. And I locked every window in my apartment, including the one above the sink. Claire is still in Harlow Creek. She's back in her house on Aldermore Street now, has been for several months. She sounds like herself on the phone. She laughs the same way. She asks about the same things she always asked about. Most of the time, she is exactly who she was. Most of the time. There are moments, small ones, the kind you could easily explain away if you wanted to, where something moves behind her eyes that I don't recognize. A fraction of a second, a calculation where there used to be just a response. I notice it the way you notice a faint smell in a room that you can't identify, but that your body responds to before your mind catches up. I've kept the note, not in the house, not in the car, somewhere I won't say. I haven't received another letter. I check the window above my kitchen sink every night before I go to bed. I check the courtyard below. I've started keeping a log of my own, not because I've seen anything, but because Claire taught me that the time to start documenting is before you need the documentation, not after. The case is technically open, technically unresolved. Claire doesn't talk about it, and I don't push. We have arrived at a kind of arrangement. We go on. We call twice a week. We talk about almost nothing. And once 2 months ago, very quietly, almost at the end of a phone call, she said, "I think I'm remembering things, just small things. It's like they're coming back in pieces." I asked her what kind of things. She paused. "Sounds," she said, "mostly sounds." We didn't talk about it after that. We said good night. We hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my apartment for a long time, thinking about the note, thinking about the fence, thinking about the particular sound of something pressing against old wood from the outside, the specific weight of something that is watching and patient and not yet done. And sometimes, the most unsettling part isn't what happened. It's that it could happen to anyone, even you. End card. Silence.
That's all for tonight. If this story stayed with you, good. That means it worked. If you have your own confession, something you've never said out loud, something that still doesn't make sense, you know where to find us. Drop it below. And if you're not already here, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from. Psychotic Confessions will be in the dark.